I'm Nadia Taylor, Training and Exercise Manager for the Readiness Support Center. And this is Semper Gumby, a podcast about emergency management in the Corps of Engineers. We'll cover topics about disaster response and recovery, FEMA mission assignments, and Corps-specific response authorities under which we operate for things like flood fighting and coastal emergencies. So today we're going to be talking about HF radio, or high-frequency radio, specifically the HF radio program within the Corps of Engineers. And we have with us Chuck Miller. So Chuck, what do you do for the Corps?
I am the subject matter expert for the Corps on high-frequency, long-haul radio communications, and I manage the national program for the Corps.
For the uninitiated, what exactly is high-frequency radio?
High-frequency radio is radios that can talk to each other around the world using skip or bouncing off the atmosphere and be able to talk to anybody at any time based on various frequencies.
What is skip exactly?
Skip is where the radio signal comes out of the antenna, hits the atmosphere, bounces back down to the earth, and then backs up to the atmosphere and bounces around the earth many times, and eventually it finds this radio station it's looking for.
So this is different than the AM, FM radio stations we're used to, right?
Well, the FM stations are pretty much line-of-sight stations, so you can see the antenna. With your antenna, you can talk. AM can sometimes bounce around the world, but FM and the other radios that they use for cabs and ambulances are line-of-sight, called VHF and UHF. But for HF, that's low frequency, and that'll go around the world.
Why would somebody use HF radio?
When all other forms of communications have failed, HF radio has always gotten through. It's been around for about 100 years.
Whenever a calamity occurs, the ham operator courageously and unselfishly comes to the service of the community. Radio offers continuous inspiration to render aid in times of stress.
Amateur radio operators have used it in disasters, and they can turn around and send voice, Morse code, or CW. They send pictures or facsimile. With trained operators, they can communicate any time of the day.
So like in the clip we just heard, HF radio operators are kind of like ham operators?
Yeah, it's basically the ham radio operators and HF radio for the federal side is the same thing. We just share different frequencies based on allotment by the government. And so if you're a ham radio operator, you can pretty much do what we do in the Corps. But we in the Corps have some additional capabilities such as encryption and some other small functions that we do beyond what amateur radio operators do. Amateurs can only do things in the clear. They can't encrypt any of their signals.
Why does the Corps have this HF radio program?
The Corps has the HF radio program so that when a disaster strikes and other forms of communications fail or are overloaded, what happens a lot of times with satellite communications, everybody nowadays have satellite phones. And the initial onset of a disaster, everybody gets on, just like a cell phone, everybody gets on their cell phones, and the transponders on a satellite are overloaded, and the people can't always get through. HF radio isn't dependent on any of that. It's simply radio to radio. There is no infrastructure to foul it up.
How does the program in the Corps work? You're the national program manager. Do we have other places where we have HF radios that can talk to each other?
Yeah, within the Corps, there are basically two different HF radio programs. There's the emergency HF radio net, which consists of selected fixed stations, and our mobile units called DTOS, or Deployable Tactical Operations Systems. And we then have the capability through headquarters to command and control our DTOS units when they're on the move or when their other communications are having problems. So that's the emergency side of the house. We also have a side of the house where all other USACE elements, districts, divisions, labs, can also have HF radio on a different setup and a different network, and they can turn around and communicate amongst themselves. And they do it a lot of times on a daily basis to track water flows and things like that to keep their operators trained. In addition, there's one other thing we do in the Corps, and that is we interface with other federal agencies, both in and out of the Department of Homeland Security.
So at every district or division, there is an HF radio that can communicate to other HF radios at any other district or division. Is that right?
Basically, you have the concept right, except for not all districts and all divisions have elected to maintain their HF radio. Some of them have stayed and gone with satellite comms, and because of their proximity, that's all they use. However, the districts and divisions that are spread out geographically large areas are using HF radios to take care of their day-to-day basis. Those districts and divisions that are constantly impacted or have the capability of being impacted by earthquake, those areas, especially along the Mississippi, a lot of the districts and divisions there have those radios, including Millington, logistics, and so those units do test on a monthly basis for the most part.
What about on the disaster side, when a disaster strikes? How exactly would we use HF radio? Like, what is the process?
Well, we've practiced the process. Matter of fact, a little while back, we had an earthquake exercise with Alaska. And so when they announced they had an earthquake, the lines for all the communications in the district were cut. They had no land, they had no phone, they had no satellite. So they used HF to contact me down here in Mobile, Alabama. And then I turned around and took their message through a landline, emailed it to headquarters. Headquarters made a response, gave it back to me, and I gave the commander and the one-star general the response to their message, stating they had been involved in an incident and how bad they were hurt. So basically what happens is the HF radio station calls a corresponding radio station, and they act as the communications link when there are no other means of communications.
So that was for an exercise, but have we ever used this in a real disaster response?
We've had only one time that we actually used it. It was 9/11, World Trade Center. Initially, when we got on site with our DTOS units, there were very limited means of communicating out of the area due to the fact that the Verizon building and the World Trade Center buildings were damaged and all the communications and landlines were cut. And so we used the HF radio to communicate back to another federal agency. We acted for them to give their command what they needed to get some reinforcements and some response gear into the area. So that's the only time we've ever used it.
Well, how do we keep people trained up to speed since deployments seem kind of rare for this program?
Well, the training happens two ways. We have CD modules or DVD modules in which we send out, which give you long-distance learning. In addition, we do monthly tests with HF radio stations. We have, again, two nets. We have an emergency net that we test on Wednesdays of CSCP. That's the Communications System Check Program that we do in the Corps every month. And that checks everything: phones, red book, fax machines, secure phones, secure fax. But we also do HF radio.
Charlie 3535, COE.
Roger, got a copy, go ahead.
Roger. Yeah, COE clear.
And then on Thursday of that week, we also test with the regular HF units in the Corps. Now, sometimes they can't make that date, and we'll meet them and help them test on other days.
So, Chuck, if we don't use HF radio that often, why do we need HF radio?
HF radio is kind of like that car insurance you have. You hope you never need it, but when you do, it's there. So HF radio will always get through. With trained operators, you'll always get through at any time, day or night, to communicate to the other end. That can't always be said when you have the electronic infrastructure of the internet and the fibers throughout the United States. When things are damaged or unable to communicate, HF, again, all it requires is a radio, an antenna, and a power supply, and it can talk. It doesn't require any other infrastructure to support it.
All right, Chuck, well, thanks. I guess we'll wrap it up here. So how do you wrap up an HF radio call?
Well, basically, you call the distant station, and I'll give you an example. I would say, Whiskey Uniform Alpha, this is Whiskey Uniform Zulu, negative feather, out.
Well, thanks, Chuck. Or how about Whiskey Uniform Zulu, this is Romeo Sierra Charlie, negative further, out. That's all we have for today's episode. Thanks for joining us, and we hope you've learned something. Please subscribe to our feed and check back for future episodes. I'm Nadia Taylor, and this is Semper Gumby.